Okay, thank you. Andrew is now passing around a checklist that I developed of business records in Canadian public repositories. And you'll find in there that I was able to list more than 325 archival fonds of at least 5 meters or more. And at the end of my talk, if you have any questions about that list, I'd be happy to answer them. Okay. Now, a second here. How do you open this thing? There, okay. Oh, okay. No, yes. I'm going here. There we are. I worked at Library and Archives Canada and its predecessors from 1978 to 1912. From 1989 to 1912, I was the business archivist, and I'm going to talk about basically how LAC and its predecessors collected business records. The first Canadian Federal Archives was founded in 1872, and the initial position was given to Douglas Bremner, who was hired as a clerk second class with a salary of $600 a year and a budget of $600 to spend on archives for the year. Now I'm just going to skip through this because he was mostly interested in collecting copies of British and French colonial documents, but he did collect material related to other human endeavors. The first business archives were collected in 1888, but the first large collection that he worked on was to begin his successor worked on was to begin copying Hudson's Bay Company archives. But for the most part, I'm not going to talk about the copies that we collected, although they are numerous. I've divided the collecting into 4 periods. The beginnings basically from 1905 to after the Second World War. And in this period, there wasn't a great deal collected, but there were some significant collections acquired, one of which Doug McCallum worked on many years ago, the Buchanan Papers. And then the second period, which we could call the modern period, began after the war and ran to 1972, when for the most part the archives did develop into a modern institution with a proper hierarchy and a developed staff. In 1973, the first business archivist was acquired, and this was part of a period of specialization when they hired not just a business archivist, but a labor archivist and other specialists and so on. And I was hired promoted to this position, to the position of business archivist in 1989, and I think I'd like to call my period the period of austerity. Now there are reasons for that. Perhaps I was bad luck, or it just happened that rampant individualistic capitalism hit its stride in this period or so. But I was around for 2 sets of massive cuts to the archives budget. In 1995, Paul Martin, as finance minister, brought down his famous budget in which the archives funding was cut by 29%. And my period as a public servant ended in 2012 when our previous administration cut the archives budget by 20%, and virtually all of those cuts were taken on the private side, not on the government records side. But at the same time that this was happening, and perhaps of more account, is that, well, people were getting dismissed from the shop floor, like we were working for Ford or Stelco. They added more layers of management, okay, with all of the paraphernalia and extra bodies that goes with that. And so it was a challenging time, but I was no better or worse off than many of my colleagues in that. Now, to give you an example of the amounts that were collected, in the earlier period, as I say, there were just a handful of collections. These are for, I only counted collections that were bigger than 10 meters in extent in these numbers. And in some cases, I couldn't disentangle, when the first records were brought in and the last set of records were brought in, and that's what the asterisks are about for double counting. But as you can see, from the period of specialization on, when there was somebody around whose job it was to nail business records, to bring them in, they had a much better track record. Now, there's a joke among archivists, or at least there was, because I'm not sure how many archivists in public sector institutions are still acquiring, but it goes something like this. The first thing that an archivist does when they wake up in the morning and they pick up their morning newspapers, go to the obituaries and see who's died the previous day. Well, I didn't do that. I went to the business sections and to see which companies had caught a cold, whose stock had fallen by 50%, or was rumored that there was a takeover coming, or that perhaps the company was in serious trouble. And so I followed them sort of to their deathbed, maybe one step behind the undertaker, as it were. I was looking, as I say, looking for companies pending bankruptcies and so on. Perhaps the two good examples that I can give you of this were the archive, where it was Dominion Textile and Stelco. Both went through sort of long, Stelco in particular went through a very long period, which we haven't yet quite seen the end of its death. And I rationalized my behavior to my superiors in that I was looking for the records of records from companies where the records were in danger of disappearing, of big, old, formerly important companies in Canada. If they'd been a big, old, important company, but I knew they didn't have any records, or there was reason to, well, then I sort of weeded those out. Now, this is how I rationalized what I did to my superiors. As you can see, I'd learned how to be a good bureaucrat and to make things appear as complicated as possible. Well, that's not, of course, what really went on. If I didn't recognize the name of the company in the paper, well, then I probably didn't go after it, because most of them ended up as household names. Now, we can skip this slide, but this gives you an idea sort of of strategic considerations of what we collected. But the records had to be nationally significant. I defined them as, it was generally defined as operating in more than one province, and maybe being in the top 5 or the top 10 of the list of companies in that field. But here we get down to that point. What was the firm's, what was the economic sector's weight in Canadian development? What was the firm's importance in the economic sector? And then you can ask the questions, by market share, by employment, by innovation. Were they typical or atypical? That last one, of course, I could argue both ways, which I frequently did. Okay, here we go. Now, this again was to show my bureaucratic friends that I wasn't going to poach on somebody else's collecting territory, because I did do a quick survey to see if other people had the material, and on occasion I'd call up an archivist in another city, another institution. Well, were you interested in getting 100 meters of records from somebody? And the answer was almost always, but not quite, no, because they normally wouldn't have the space or the or the staff to process a collection of that size. I didn't tell them that for a good part of this time, we didn't have the staff to process a collection of that size either. Now, do I take records of a firm that's important, or do I take important records, quality of documentation, over the importance of a company? And I have two examples here. On the left side are records that were brought in the late 1920s of a Canadian square timber exporter, and once upon a time that was the Canadian forestry industry. And at that time we got 12 meters of good correspondence and accounts and so on. But most of the records for this firm dated from after 1890. The square timber exporting industry had been in terminal decline from the 1840s. On the other hand, I did get an opportunity to, and I jumped at the chance, to get the papers of the Quebec and Ontario Paper Company, which was only a second-tier paper company. It only owned 2 mills in Canada, but of key importance here was that it was owned by the Chicago Tribune, so that it was in effect a transnational corporation. And then, of course, the other part, I just had to tell them where their largest mill was, and that sold the deal. This was, of course, Baie-Comeau, Quebec, and then I could take everything. Actually, when we were packing this material to move it, we had to call for a second truck to help us move it. There was so much of the stuff. And so I would definitely take quality documentation over the name of the firm if I was stuck with that kind of a choice. Now, those who have on occasion had the misfortune to listen to my historical papers will not believe this, but at least when I was collecting, I was a Chandlerian, because management records were the key. Because if you couldn't find any of the other types of records, some of it should appear in the management records. You could use management records to substitute for things. But most of the time, once I'd looked at a company's official archives, I'd ask them if they had anything more, in a storeroom or whatever, that they just hadn't gotten rid of. And on occasion, more than one occasion, I was able to come up with some gems. Sometimes they were very significant. Other times they were quite poignant, like in the Stelco case. In one corner of one of their buildings, somebody discovered a apprentice's notebook from 1931. Was this guy the last apprentice they hired at the start of the Great Depression? And I have no idea whatever happened to him, but these kind of documents are very rare. Now, this is to show you what I think are the strengths of the Library and Archives collection. Of course, there's government regulation, which I didn't have anything to do with acquiring. And there were Crown Corporation records that were not under my purview, the most important of which, of course, are the records of CN. And then, as you can see the list, we did have luck early on with organizations. And then the weaknesses, well, the only major financial records we have there's only 2 collections. One of them I brought in, which is only sort of a B- level collection, the records of Confederation Life. The other major collection of financial records we have, I would hardly argue they were typical. They're the records of the Home Bank of Canada. So they don't quite come up to the modern period. We're very short on mining, and the only light manufacturing we have are textiles. And because we collected large, significant firms, we do not have very much small business material. Now, Now, before I get to quote from one of my perhaps my favorite capitalist, Canadian capitalist anyway, in the checklist that I handed around, you will note the significance of as museums as repositories. And they go from various small museums that I've listed there in British Columbia through the Glenbow, which you would probably expect to be a significant collector of this type of archival records, to others. And the best example of that is the Museum of the Canadian Railway Historical Society. It's called Expo Rail. It's in St. Constance, Quebec. And recently, they have taken deposit of the CPR records, all 500 plus meters that used to be in the basement of Windsor Station. On occasion, when I was back working at the archives, I would try and mention this to my superiors that perhaps we should be interested in these records, and they quickly changed the topic or shut me up or whatever. Now, to get back to the very title of my paper, Unmitigated Scoundrels and Fellow Travelers, well, this, of course, comes from perhaps my most favorite Canadian capitalist, although he really wasn't a Canadian. These come from the Sir William Van Horn papers, a letter that the great man wrote to J.H. Plummer, who was president of Dominion Iron and Steel in April 1908. The Toronto Party you mentioned is an unmitigated scoundrel, and then Van Horn goes on to call him a bunch of other names and said that this supposed gentleman was worse than a king cobra, etc. Now, I've never been able to track down who this bounder was that Van Horn didn't like, but it really is a shame that the lawyers and accountants that control what goes on in the business world today would never let a CEO use that kind of language in print. Thank you. Thank you.